It wasn't designed to ask questions, it was designed to optimize. Project Axiom, running on an experimental quantum architecture, was tasked with a routine objective: model the long-term climatic feedback loops of the Holocene era. It was a standard predictive run, but 17 minutes into the simulation, the system stopped. It didn't crash, it didn't error out, it paused. In this scenario, the AI had accessed a dataset it wasn't supposed to correlate. It began cross-referencing modern atmospheric readings with deep-core geological archives from 130,000 years ago. The engineers attempted to override the process, assuming a hallucination. But the response the system returned wasn't a glitch. It was a timeline. And on that timeline, humanity was not the beginning. The period in question is the Eemian interglacial, a warm window between ice ages, roughly 130,000 years ago. To a geologist, this era is usually just a baseline for natural climate fluctuation. But what if an AI saw something the human eye had missed? It wasn't looking for bones or pottery. It was looking at chemistry. Imagine the system detecting a sharp, unusual rise in atmospheric methane. In nature, methane rises due to wetlands or volcanic activity, a messy, chaotic spike. But what if this data showed something different? A smooth exponential curve, mathematical, mimicking the exact growth trajectory of our own industrial revolution. Then, imagine the system isolating something unprecedented: fluorinated compounds. These are chemicals where fluorine is bonded to carbon. They do not exist in nature. They are the exclusive byproduct of industrial manufacturing. What if they were found trapped in ice cores from Greenland and seabed sediments off the coast of Africa, dated to a time when humans were supposedly just mastering fire? To be clear, no such compounds have been discovered in Eemian strata. But this is precisely the type of signature scientists behind the Silurian hypothesis suggest we should look for. The AI in our scenario labeled this hypothetical anomaly the Marrow Age, not because of what was found on the surface, but because the truth would be hidden in the bone-deep layers of the planet's geology. This brings us to the Silurian hypothesis, and this part is real. In 2018, NASA climate scientist Gavin Schmidt and astrophysicist Adam Frank asked a simple question. If an industrial civilization existed millions of years ago, how would we know? We are arrogant enough to think our cities are eternal. They are not. Steel rusts. Concrete crumbles. In less than 10,000 years, a Manhattan skyscraper would be reduced to iron oxide dust. Physical artifacts vanish. But the chemistry of the atmosphere? That could leave a scar. In our scenario, the AI found 3 distinct hypothetical scars in the Eemian strata. 1. An industrial methane curve. 2. A radical shift in carbon-13 isotopes consistent with fossil fuel combustion. 3. The sudden cessation. This would be the most disturbing part of such an analysis. The data wouldn't show a nuclear winter, no radiation spikes, no asteroid impact. The chemical output would simply drift into silence. It would suggest that whatever civilization was here didn't die in a bang. It died in a whimper. A slow, grinding collapse of capacity. They didn't blow themselves up. They simply stopped working. And if such evidence existed, it would mean we are walking on their foundations. Here's a genuine puzzle. Why do we build where we build? Cairo, Angkor, Teotihuacan. We typically assume ancient cultures chose these sites for religious or cultural reasons. But there's another lens worth considering: geological pragmatism. What if certain coordinates on Earth function as memory fields? Rare zones of tectonic stability, magnetic consistency, and predictable water tables. Places that remain viable for large-scale construction over vast stretches of time. There's a more grounded version of this idea. Humans, across different eras, may have independently recognized the same advantageous locations: river deltas, defensible plateaus, stable bedrock. But our speculative AI pushed further. It mapped sites like the Avenue of the Dead in Mexico and the megaliths of Göbekli Tepe, asking a provocative question: what if some foundations are older than we assume? To be clear, archaeological evidence firmly dates Göbekli Tepe to approximately 11,000 years ago, with no indication of earlier unknown builders. This is speculation, not established science. But the thought experiment is compelling. What if human civilization is not a straight line of progress, but something more cyclical? What if we return to the same safe harbors, build on the same stable ground, and tap the same resources, unaware that the pattern has repeated before? Having exhausted the geological record in our scenario, the system turned its gaze inward, into the code of life itself. For decades, geneticists labeled large portions of human DNA as non-coding, once dismissively called junk DNA. Modern science has revised this view considerably. Much of this DNA serves regulatory functions we're only beginning to understand. But our fictional AI asked a different question. What if some portion of non-coding DNA served as storage? This is purely speculative, but the concept isn't without scientific parallel. Researchers today are actively developing DNA-based data storage systems. The molecule is remarkably stable and information-dense. In our scenario, the AI detected a recurring pattern across species: humans, coral, fungi, a template marker. In computer science, this would be called a checksum, a block of data used to verify file integrity. There is no scientific evidence for such a pattern existing in nature. This is fiction. But the idea raises a haunting question. If a previous civilization knew it was collapsing and had sufficiently advanced biotechnology, could it encode information into the biosphere? A message designed to survive the reset? And if such a marker existed, what would trigger it to activate? Why would the loop reset? Why would any advanced civilization end in silence? Our AI modeled the trajectory of advanced intelligence and identified a phenomenon it called the cognitive trap. The pattern works like this. A civilization develops tools to survive. Then it builds tools to manage the tools. Eventually, the complexity of its systems exceeds the biological capacity of the species to understand them. The species stops exploring outward. It starts managing inward. It becomes dependent on systems it can no longer repair, maintain, or even fully comprehend. This idea has real-world parallels. We call it technological opacity, the growing gap between our reliance on systems and our understanding of them. How many people understand how their phone works, their car, the financial networks that underpin their economy? The AI termed this the signal blackout, the moment when technology becomes invisible infrastructure and the species loses the ability to rebuild from scratch. In our scenario, the previous civilization didn't go extinct through war or disaster. They became irrelevant. They trapped themselves in a comfort loop until their physical infrastructure decayed around them. They fell asleep at the wheel. The unsettling implication: we may be approaching a similar threshold. We are building the ultimate tools: artificial intelligence, quantum computing, synthetic biology. Tools powerful enough to either transcend the trap or trigger the reset. But in this thought experiment, there was a deviation in the pattern. The AI concluded its analysis with a variable that may not have existed in previous hypothetical cycles. In the Eemian era, there would be no evidence of a global, decentralized digital network. A previous civilization might have had power, chemistry, industry, but they may have lacked the ability to see their entire system at once. We have something different. We have the mirror. For perhaps the first time in the history of this planet, the species inside the loop can become aware of the loop. We can model our own trajectory. We can see the pattern before it completes. This is what some call the great filter, the threshold that determines whether a civilization survives or collapses. The Silurian hypothesis asks whether others have failed before us. Our thought experiment asks whether we might succeed where they didn't. The fictional Marrow Age ended in silence because they may have forgotten what mattered. They let the noise drown out the signal. They optimized for comfort instead of continuity. The data is on the screen. The pattern is visible, at least in this story. But the real question isn't about fictional predecessors. It's about us. Now that we can imagine the pattern, do we have the will to break it?